Welcome! You're listening to the Uncharted Lancaster podcast, where we explore the hidden histories, forgotten places, and long-buried secrets of Lancaster County. Using modern digital storytelling tools, each episode brings a new piece of local lore to life, revealing the strange, the surprising, and the stories history left behind. Let's begin.
I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are attending like a truly high-end, elegant wedding.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, so you're standing on the grounds of this beautifully restored 18th century estate in Pennsylvania. You've got, a glass of champagne in your hand.
Naturally.
Right, and the weather is just perfect. You are surrounded by these impeccably manicured formal gardens, and everywhere you look, there are these stunning stone buildings with gleaming slate roofs.
Sounds incredible.
It is. I mean, you've got elegant iron chandeliers glowing inside these rustic barns. It is just the absolute picture of pastoral historic romance, curated to absolute perfection.
But there's a catch.
There's absolutely a catch. Because I want you to shift your perspective for a minute. Walk away from the music, away from the clinking glasses, and take a short walk into the surrounding woods.
Which are right there.
Literally just a few hundred yards away from that pristine scene. And hidden right there beneath the trees, overgrown with like 2.5 centuries of brush, lies this massive, miles-long trench.
A huge scar in the earth.
Exactly. And this trench, it wasn't carved by a river, it wasn't formed by a glacier. It was dug entirely by hand through solid rock by captured German soldiers during the American Revolutionary War.
The juxtaposition there is just incredibly stark. I mean, you have the pinnacle of modern leisurely celebration sitting right beside, well, basically a physical monument to some of the most brutal manual labor conditions imaginable.
Right.
It really forces you to reconcile two completely different realities that occupy the exact same geographic coordinates.
Which brings us to today. Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack the fascinating, totally multi-layered history of what is known as the Hessian Ditch.
Located at the historic Elizabeth Furnace in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania.
Yes, exactly. We're looking at how a single plot of land can serve as this wild microcosm of early American industrialization, war, and then eventual modern reclamation.
And to do this, we've pulled together quite a stack of sources.
We really have. We've got local historical accounts, geological surveys of the region, over a century of newspaper archives stretching all the way from 1921 to 2026, and even architectural retrospectives detailing the modern restoration of the site.
And when you layer all those documents together, the narrative goes so far beyond a simple historical footnote.
Oh, absolutely. I was just like pure amazement reading through this. How does one plot of land contain ancient seas, flamboyant colonial tycoons, prisoner of war labor camps, a tragic presidential romance, and, modern-day wedding receptions?
It's a lot to take in. But really, the land itself is the primary character here. The geography and geology dictated every single human event that unfolded on that property.
Which is so interesting.
Yeah, because the Hessian Ditch, it exists solely because of this insatiable, almost desperate demand for resources during a time of total war. Mm-hmm. And, the absolute limitations of the natural environment to provide those resources without massive human intervention.
Right. The environment was the bottleneck. So before we can even touch on why anyone would force prisoners to dig a 1.3-mile ditch through solid rock in the middle of the woods, we have to establish the baseline of the land itself.
We have to talk about the Elizabeth Furnace.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because an 18th century blast furnace doesn't just, spring up anywhere. It requires a very specific triad of natural resources to function.
Right. You need iron ore, you need endless timber, and you need moving water.
All in one spot.
Exactly. And to understand why those three things converged in this specific spot just north of Lidditz, Pennsylvania, you have to look at the deep geological history of the Blue Ridge Hills, specifically the section known as the Furnace Hills.
Okay, so take us back. Geologically speaking, what's going on here?
Well, these hills are a fascinating anomaly because they're actually the youngest part of the county by many millions of years.
Which feels totally counterintuitive when you look at them, right? Because they seem so ancient and weathered.
Yeah, but the soil composition tells a completely different story. The surrounding valleys, like where the town of Leiditz sits, those are built on a really deep limestone base.
Okay.
But as you move into the Furnace Hills, suddenly the earth shifts to this dense red sandstone.
And what does that red sandstone actually mean?
That transition from limestone to red sandstone is literally the fingerprint of an ancient landlocked sea.
Wow.
Yeah. Millions of years ago, this specific elevated region was essentially a coastal environment.
And we know this for sure.
Conclusively, the 1921 geological surveys of the area, which, by the way, we still rely on today, they documented these wave-washed beach pebbles deeply embedded in the sandstones of the hills.
That's wild. Finding beach pebbles in the middle of a Pennsylvania forest.
I know, right? So tectonic activity eventually pushed this ancient seabed upward, creating the red sandstone ridges. And then over millennia, those ridges were blanketed by incredibly dense, old-growth hardwood forests.
And crucially, the geological processes that formed that sandstone also created massive, really rich deposits of iron ore right close to the surface.
It's the ultimate 18th century industrial jackpot.
Seriously, you have the ore in the earth, and you have the fuel, the massive hardwood trees growing directly on top of it.
Right. It was an ecosystem perfectly primed for exploitation, provided, someone had the capital and the engineering knowledge to extract it.
Because the indigenous populations had obviously lived alongside these resources for centuries, but they utilized the land in a sustainable way.
Exactly. It took a very specific kind of European industrial vision to look at that forest and see a factory.
And that vision arrived in 1750, right?
Yes, with a German immigrant named Jacob Huber.
So Huber acquires, 400 acres along this mountain range?
Yeah, 400 acres. He builds a blast furnace and starts casting 5-plate stoves.
Okay, pause. For anyone unfamiliar, what exactly is a 5-plate stove?
Oh, often called a jam stove. It was a massive technological leap for colonial heating.
Really? How so?
Well, instead of losing all your heat up a massive open fireplace chimney, you had this enclosed iron box that radiated heat into the room.
Oh, I see. So it was way more efficient.
Massively more efficient. They were heavy, they were expensive, and they were in incredibly high demand. So Huber starts making these, and he names his operation Elizabeth Furnace.
Which is a detail that has been shrouded in a bit of local mythology over the years, hasn't it?
It has. There was this long-standing rumor that the furnace was named in honor of a British queen, likely Queen Elizabeth I.
Which would be a very strange tribute for a German immigrant in the mid-1700s to make.
Highly unlikely, yeah. And the historical records clear that up nicely. He named the furnace after his own daughter, Elizabeth Huber.
Ah, so it was a family business.
Completely. And the name stuck so firmly that when the local government organized the surrounding area into a new township in 1757, primarily to establish a tax base around this booming industry, by the way, they named the entire jurisdiction Elizabeth Township.
Okay, so we really need to pause here and define what an 18th century iron furnace actually was, because I think the terminology can be deceiving.
Oh, absolutely. When we hear furnace, we tend to think of like a large boiler in a basement or maybe a blacksmith's forge.
Right, something relatively small.
But an operation like Elizabeth Furnace was an absolute behemoth. I mean, it was an environmental apex predator.
The math in the sources is just terrifying. To keep a blast furnace the size of Elizabeth Furnace operating, the logistics of fuel consumption are almost unbelievable.
Do you want to break down the numbers?
Yeah, so a furnace of this scale required 250 acres of mature woodland per year just to sustain its fires.
Think about the density of an old-growth Pennsylvania forest. 250 acres cleared every single year.
It breaks down to 1 entire acre of timber required to keep the iron furnace in blast for just 24 hours.
Every single day, an acre of forest disappeared.
Which is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And the critical mechanical detail here is that you cannot simply chop down an oak tree and throw raw logs into a smelting furnace, right?
No, absolutely not. Raw green wood contains way too much moisture.
Right.
When you burn it, a massive amount of the combustion energy is wasted simply boiling off the water inside the wood. It will never reach the 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit required to melt iron ore.
2,800 degrees, so raw wood won't cut it.
No, you need pure carbon, you need charcoal.
Okay, so transforming an acre of raw timber into usable charcoal every single day, that requires an entire parallel industry operating out in the woods.
Yes. The people doing this work were called colliers. And their daily reality was grueling.
It sounds like a nightmare. First, the trees had to be felled using nothing but axes and crosscut saws, right?
Just brutal manual labor. And then the wood couldn't even be used immediately. It had to be stacked and seasoned for 6 months just to begin drying out.
So they were always working months in advance. And then what?
Once seasoned, the logs were loaded onto wooden sleds. You couldn't use wheeled carts easily in the dense, rocky terrain of the Furnace Hills.
Right, the sandstone we talked about.
Exactly. So horses or mules dragged these heavy sleds to designated burn areas deep in the forest. And this is where the colliers built what were called charcoal hearths or pits.
Now, the process of building a charcoal pit is really a master class in controlled chemistry, isn't it? Even long before they had the language of modern chemistry to describe it.
It really is. The colliers would stack the seasoned wood tent style around a central chimney pole. They were creating this massive, tightly packed circular mound.
How big are we talking?
They could be 25 feet across and perhaps 10 to 15 feet high.
That is basically a wooden house.
A solid house of wood, yeah. And the construction had to be incredibly meticulous. If the wood was packed too loosely, the fire would burn too fast.
And if it was packed too tightly?
It wouldn't burn at all. So once the mound was built perfectly, they covered the entire wooden structure with a thick layer of leaves and dirt.
Okay, now, if you ever tried to keep a campfire going, you know that throwing a shovel full of dirt on it is exactly how you put it out.
Right, exactly.
But the colliers weren't trying to build a roaring fire, were they? They were executing a process called pyrolysis.
Precisely. Pyrolysis is basically the thermal decomposition of materials at elevated temperatures in an inert or highly oxygen-deprived atmosphere.
Got it.
By covering the wood in dirt, they allowed it to smolder. The heat bakes out all the remaining water vapor, the volatile gases, and the sap, leaving behind almost pure carbon.
So to start this, the colliers would drop burning embers down that central chimney pole, seal it up, and then the waiting began.
And it was a long wait. These massive dirt-covered mounds would smolder for up to 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah. The men had to live out in the woods in these tiny temporary huts, watching the pits day and night.
I read that they had to actually walk carefully on top of the smoldering mounds, looking for soft spots.
That's right. Because if flames poked through the dirt shell, oxygen was getting in. And if oxygen gets in, the wood just turns to useless ash.
So they had to constantly shovel fresh dirt onto these active vents to choke the fire.
It was incredibly dangerous work. I mean, a collier could easily misstep, fall through the dirt crust, and drop straight into a 1,000-degree pit of smoldering carbon.
Oh, my God. That is horrific.
It was a very real risk, and you have to picture the scene. Because Elizabeth Furnace operated largely in the winter months, when labor wasn't needed for farming, the visual impact on the landscape was basically apocalyptic.
I was just thinking that. It sounds like a massive forest-clearing, slow-cooked barbecue.
A terrifying one, yeah.
Yeah.
You had these massive glowing red mounds dotting the freezing hillsides for miles around, pumping out thick, acrid smoke day and night.
And you can actually still find the physical evidence today.
You can. If you hike through the Furnace Hills, you will occasionally come across these large, perfectly circular indentations in the earth where the soil is stained pitch black.
Even 250 years later.
Even now. Nothing grows quite right in those spots because the soil chemistry was permanently altered by the sheer volume of charcoal dust baked into the ground.
Wow. So how did this localized environmental devastation tie into the broader economy of the colonies? Because the overhead to run an operation like this must have been just staggering.
Unbelievably high. You have hundreds of men swinging axes, driving sled teams, tending charcoal pits, digging ore out of the sandstone, and managing the high-pressure environment of the blast furnace itself.
It's an entire army of workers.
Yeah. Sustaining that level of localized, intensive industry in the 1750s required a staggering amount of capital and, honestly, a very specific type of managerial ambition.
Right, because Jacob Huber, he had the vision to start it, but he didn't have the personality to turn it into an empire.
No, he did.
That required someone with an almost like megalomaniacal drive.
Yeah.
Which brings us to one of the most eccentric figures in early American history, Henry William Stiegel.
Ah, yes. Often referred to in historical texts as Baron von Stiegel. Though it's important to note right off the bat that the title of Baron was entirely self-appointed.
Wait, he just made it up?
Totally made it up. There is no record of him holding any actual noble title in Europe whatsoever.
That perfectly encapsulates the man, honestly. So Stiegel emigrates from Germany in 1752. He makes his way to Lancaster County, goes to work for Jacob Huber, and rapidly ascends the social ladder by marrying his boss's 18-year-old daughter.
Elizabeth. the namesake of the furnace.
Exactly.
Mm.
So within a few years, Stiegel utilizes investments from wealthy backers in Philadelphia to completely buy out his father-in-law.
But Stiegel isn't interested in just running a successful provincial ironworks. He wants a kingdom.
Oh, totally. His ambition was boundlessly aggressive. He systematically bought up the land surrounding the original 400 acres until his estate encompassed an astonishing 10,454 acres of timbered forest.
He wasn't just securing his fuel supply, he was establishing a feudal domain.
He effectively built a company town before the concept was even widely recognized in American industry. By 1763, Stiegel's workforce had cleared massive tracts of land to construct this entirely self-sustaining ecosystem around the furnace.
Right. They built a company store, a sawmill, a gristmill for grain, a blacksmith shop, a bakery, sprawling livestock barns, and these massive communal gardens.
So the workers didn't just work for Stiegel. They bought their food from him, they lived in houses he owned, and relied on his infrastructure for basic survival.
And he also diversified his industrial output. Before he founded the town of Mannheim and established his famous glassworks there, his initial experiments in glassmaking happened right at Elizabeth Furnace.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. Archaeological surveys of the surrounding hills still regularly turn up shards of early Stiegel glass.
Oh, because he was dumping it.
Exactly. Largely because the estate was so massive, he simply used the surrounding forest as a dumping ground for his failed glass batches.
That is so fitting. And Stiegel lived like European royalty. He built a massive mansion out of the local red sandstone, outfitting it with luxury goods imported from Europe.
But his psychological need for validation went far beyond just having a nice house.
Way beyond. The historical accounts paint him as deeply self-centered and obsessed with pageantry.
The contrast is jarring. He had hundreds of men toiling in incredibly brutal conditions, breathing charcoal dust, risking their lives in the iron mines, working 14-hour days.
And what does Stiegel do to oversee this? In 1769, he decides to construct a 75-foot-high wooden tower on the highest ridge above the furnace.
That ridge became known appropriately as Cannon Hill.
A 75-foot wooden tower in the 1700s. The logistics of building that on top of a sandstone hill are formidable.
It required massive timber framing, deep footings, and a tremendous diversion of labor away from the profitable iron and charcoal production.
And it wasn't a watchtower or a functional piece of industrial infrastructure, was it?
No, not at all. It was an entertainment complex in the sky.
An entertainment complex.
Yeah. The tower featured multiple levels of banquet halls where he would host lavish parties for his wealthy friends from Philadelphia.
I read he was notoriously paranoid about being robbed, so the height offered a defensive vantage point. But the primary function was pure ego.
Absolute ego. The crowning feature literally was the cannon mounted on the very top deck.
Okay, we have to talk about the cannon. Because he didn't use it for defense. He utilized that cannon as an acoustic instrument of power.
It was a signaling device. Whenever Stiegel was traveling back to Elizabeth Furnace from his other properties, his carriage would approach the valley.
And his workers had strict standing orders, right?
Very strict. The moment his carriage was sighted, they were to fire the cannon from the top of the 75-foot tower.
He used artillery as a doorbell.
Basically, yes. It was a sonic blast across the valley to inform the peasants that the Baron had returned home.
That is just, wow, the sheer narcissism.
And the acoustic properties of the valley would have amplified the blast for miles. Historical records also note that he fired the cannon on specific days to signal payday to the woodchoppers and colliers working deep in the 10,000-acre forest.
Just echoing across the hills to call them back to the company store. The psychological whiplash of that environment is stunning to me. I mean, think about it. You have men whose skin is permanently stained black from charcoal dust, living in dirt huts in freezing temperatures, and every so often, a cannon blasts over their heads to signal that the boss has arrived in his carriage to drink imported wine in a 75-foot party tower.
It's straight out of a novel. But a business model built on that level of flamboyant vanity and unchecked spending is inherently fragile.
How did an unsustainable business model like that last as long as it did?
Well, it shattered predictably, actually. Stiegel's empire was built entirely on leverage.
Debt.
Massive debt. He continually borrowed money from Philadelphia merchants to fund his expansion, buying more forges, establishing the town of Mannheim, pouring massive capital into his glassmaking ventures to compete with British imports.
And his personal life had already suffered a severe blow by this point, right?
Yes. The furnace's namesake, his wife Elizabeth, died tragically just 10 days after giving birth to their second daughter in 1758.
Oh, that's awful.
He remarried a woman from Philadelphia shortly after, which likely helped him secure more credit temporarily, but his financial mismanagement eventually caught up with him.
Because the colonial economy contracted in the early 1770s.
Exactly. And when that happened, his creditors demanded repayment.
And Stiegel had zero liquidity. His wealth was entirely tied up in land, timber, and the physical infrastructure of his vanity projects.
Right. You can't pay a debt with a 75-foot wooden tower.
So the empire collapses rapidly. And in 1770, the flamboyant Baron von Stiegel is arrested and thrown into debtor's prison.
He loses the mansion, he loses the glassworks, he loses the 10,000 acres, and he loses the cannon tower.
He goes from the absolute zenith of colonial wealth to a cold prison cell. But an industrial asset like Elizabeth Furnace doesn't just sit idle, does it?
No, the creditors took over the property. And the vacuum left by Stiegel's massive ego creates the perfect entry point for a man who is his absolute psychological antithesis.
It's your Robert Coleman.
Yes. Robert Coleman is the archetype of the meticulous, highly pragmatic, self-made industrialist.
Where did he come from?
He emigrated from County Donegal in Northern Ireland in 1764 at the age of 16.
So unlike Stiegel, he didn't arrive with a self-appointed aristocratic title or a network of wealthy investors.
Not at all. He started his career at the absolute bottom, working as a simple clerk. He cut his teeth at Hopewell Forge, which was near Elizabeth Furnace, and then moved through various other ironmaking operations in Pennsylvania.
And Coleman didn't care about banquets or towers, right?
No, Coleman cared about ledgers, efficiency, and margins.
So when Stiegel's operation implodes, Coleman looks at it and sees a drastically mismanaged asset with immense potential.
Exactly. And in 1776, he secured a lease to take over operations at Elizabeth Furnace.
The timing of that lease is perhaps the most consequential business decision of his life. Because 1776 isn't just a random year on the calendar.
No, it is the beginning of the American Revolutionary War.
Right. The colonies declare independence, and virtually overnight, the economic landscape shifts from a peacetime export economy to a wartime mobilization.
The Continental Army desperately needs munitions. They need cannonballs, grape shot, artillery pieces, and raw iron stock for blacksmiths to forge weapons and camp equipment.
And the newly formed American government is issuing massive defense contracts. So Robert Coleman, this hyper-efficient Irish immigrant, suddenly controls one of the most capable iron furnaces in the colonies, just as demand skyrockets to unprecedented levels.
He immediately secures lucrative contracts to supply George Washington's Continental Army. But scaling up production to meet wartime demand instantly exposed the critical engineering flaw in the Elizabeth Furnace setup.
And this is where we get to the crux of the whole episode. Because the bottleneck wasn't a lack of iron ore, and it wasn't a lack of timber.
The bottleneck was kinetic energy.
To understand the engineering hurdle Coleman faced, we have to look really closely at how a blast furnace actually operates.
Right. You don't just light a fire and let it burn.
No. To achieve the 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit required to liquefy iron ore, you have to force massive amounts of oxygen into the combustion chamber.
And this is achieved using a cold air blast engine, essentially, a gigantic set of mechanical bellows.
Your bellows were monumental pieces of equipment, often constructed of heavy wood and massive sheets of leather, right?
Yes. Capable of pumping thousands of cubic feet of air per minute, and human muscle cannot operate them. You require a continuous, reliable source of mechanical power.
And at Elizabeth Furnace, that power came from a massive wooden water wheel situated on a local stream, appropriately named Furnace Run.
The physics are pretty straightforward, but brilliant. The flowing water furnace run pushes the paddles of the water wheel.
The wheel turns a massive axle.
And the axle is fitted with wooden cams, essentially asymmetrical lobes.
So as the axle turns, these cams press down on the levers of the bellows, compressing them and shooting a blast of cold air into the furnace.
Exactly. As the cam rotates past, heavy counterweights pull the bellows back open to draw in fresh air, and the cycle repeats continuously.
The key word there is continuously, right? A blast furnace must operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months at a time during its blast cycle.
It absolutely has to. If the airflow stops, the temperature drops.
Wait, so if it stops, it's ruined?
Yes. Because if the temperature drops too far, the molten iron and slag inside the furnace will solidify into a massive, solid plug of metal and rock.
Oh, wow.
If that happens, the furnace is effectively destroyed. You literally have to dismantle the entire stone structure to remove the plug and rebuild it from scratch.
That is terrifying from a business perspective. So the lifeblood of the entire operation is the steady flow of water in Furnace Run.
But Furnace Run had a fatal geographical flaw. It was a relatively minor stream.
So during the dry summer months or during unseasonably dry autumns, the water level would drop significantly.
And the flow wouldn't have enough kinetic energy to turn the massive water wheel at the required speed.
The billows would slow down, the furnace temperature would drop, and Coleman would have to prematurely end the blast cycle, halting all production.
Right. And you cannot explain to General George Washington that your artillery shipments are delayed because it hasn't rained in a few weeks.
Sorry, General, bad weather. Yeah, that's not going to fly.
No. Coleman needed a permanent engineering solution to increase the water volume. So he surveyed the surrounding topography and identified a neighboring water source called Seglock Run.
Seglock, which is derived from an indigenous name meaning saw gap or saw valley, right?
Yes. The historical surveys note that Seglock was a pristine, fast-flowing stream with a sandy bottom. And crucially, it maintained a strong, reliable flow year-round, regardless of local drought conditions.
So the objective was clear. If Coleman could divert the strong flow of Seglock Run and merge it into the weaker flow of Furnace Run, he would double his water power.
Ensuring his water wheel could run at maximum efficiency 365 days a year.
The war effort demanded it, and his contracts depended on it. But identifying the solution and executing it were two entirely different things.
Because Seglock Run and Furnace Run were separated by the imposing mass of Cannon Hill.
Right. You can't just dig a shallow trench and expect water to flow predictably over a mile of uneven terrain.
Connecting the two streams required an incredibly precise piece of civil engineering. The canal had to maintain a highly specific downward elevation gradient over a distance of 1.3 miles to utilize gravity flow.
Because if the gradient was too steep, the water would rush, erode the banks, and destroy the canal.
And if it was too shallow, the water would pool and stagnate.
So maintaining that perfect gradient meant that the trench couldn't just follow the surface of the earth. In many places, it had to cut deeply into the side of the hill.
We're talking about excavating a channel that was uniformly 6 to 7 feet wide and, depending on the natural elevation, up to 7 feet deep.
It was a head-height subterranean corridor.
And remember the geology we established earlier. Cannon Hill is composed of dense red sandstone, heavily compacted and laced with massive, immovable boulders.
And this is 1777. There are no steam shovels, no backhoes.
And they certainly weren't wasting precious, expensive black powder to blast a ditch when they needed it for the war effort.
Every single cubic yard that 1.3-mile canal had to be extracted by human muscle, which presents a catastrophic logistical hurdle. Where do you find the labor?
That's the million-dollar question.
The colonies are in a state of total war mobilization. Almost every able-bodied man is either serving in the Continental Army, fighting for the British Loyalists, or already working 14-hour days to keep the agrarian economy from collapsing. Coleman certainly can't pull his highly skilled iron workers off the furnace to dig a ditch. Their expertise is required to cast the cannons.
So faced with this labor vacuum, Coleman taps into his political network. He reaches out to a prominent local figure in Lancaster County named Edward Hand.
And Hand isn't just a local politician. He is a physician and an incredibly high-ranking military officer serving directly as the adjutant general to George Washington.
Hand is basically a high-level logistical fixer for the Continental Army.
Coleman presents him with a pragmatic proposition. I have the capacity to produce all the artillery your army requires to win this war, but my factory is starved of water power. I need men to dig a canal to power the bellows.
And Adjutant General Hand understands the strategic necessity. So he offers a solution that is brilliant, highly controversial, and deeply complex.
He offers Coleman prisoners of war.
Specifically, the Hessians.
Okay, we need to dive deep here, because to understand the gravity of this arrangement, we have to strip away a lot of the mythological baggage surrounding the Hessians.
Oh, absolutely. American popular history often reduces them to ruthless, bloodthirsty mercenaries who fought simply for a paycheck.
Right. But the geopolitical reality is far more structured and, frankly, deeply tragic for the men involved. Can you clarify the economics of this for us?
Sure. The distinction between a mercenary and an auxiliary force is vital here. A mercenary is an independent contractor. He chooses to fight, he negotiates his own pay, and he keeps the money.
But the Hessians were an auxiliary force.
Yes, which means they were an entire standing army leased out by their sovereign ruler to a foreign power.
They originated primarily from the Landgraviate of Hesse Castle, right?
Yeah.
Which was a relatively poor, landlocked principality in Germany.
Right. The ruler, Landgrave Frederick II, maintained an enormous, highly drilled, standing army out of proportion to his small territory.
Why did he have such a big army if the territory was so small?
Because he utilized this army essentially as his primary economic export. When the British Empire found itself unable to recruit enough of its own citizens to suppress the American rebellion, they turned to Frederick II.
So the British signed treaties to essentially rent tens of thousands of Hessian soldiers.
Yes. And the crucial detail is that the individual soldiers did not receive this money. The British paid the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel directly.
So the sovereign used that massive influx of British silver to pay off his national debts, fund public works projects, and maintain his opulent lifestyle.
His subjects were quite literally treated as human currency.
That is so dark. They were conscripted, forced to leave their families, marched to the coast, packed onto horribly overcrowded British transport ships, and sent across the Atlantic.
To fight a war in a country they had never seen against colonists they had no personal quarrel with.
And the numbers are huge. The British ultimately deployed roughly 30,000 to 37,000 Hessian troops to America.
Meaning they constituted an astonishing 25%, a full quarter of the entire British occupying force.
Which infuriated the American colonists. The Declaration of Independence explicitly cites the king's use of large armies of foreign mercenaries as a prime justification for rebellion.
It was viewed as a deep, unforgivable insult that galvanized colonial resistance. But despite the politics, the Americans deeply respected the Hessians' martial prowess.
They're universally feared on the battlefield.
Their military discipline was legendary. The conscription laws in Hesse-Kassel were brutal, and the training was relentless.
They were equipped with heavy muskets and long bayonets. But there's this one fascinating detail from the sources. They had an incredibly strict physical requirements for enlistment.
Yes, you had to meet a minimum height requirement, which made their formations physically imposing. And, remarkably, they possessed a strict dental requirement.
Okay, wait, a dental requirement in 1776. Usually, armies of this era were just desperate for warm bodies. You're telling me they cared about dental hygiene?
It had absolutely nothing to do with hygiene. It was a matter of lethal functionality.
How so?
Well, the standard infantry weapon of the era was the muzzle-loading flintlock musket. The gunpowder and the lead ball were packaged together in a heavy paper cartridge.
Okay.
In the chaos of a battle, a soldier had to hold his heavy musket with both hands, reach into his cartridge box, pull out the paper cartridge, and use his front teeth to violently bite and rip off the end of the paper to expose the powder.
So if you don't have strong front teeth, you can't bite the cartridge open. And if you can't bite the cartridge open, you can't pour the powder down the barrel, and you are effectively useless on the firing line.
Right.
That is a viscerally dark detail. It reduces a soldier entirely to his mechanical utility.
It does. So you have these incredibly formidable, physically imposing, well-drilled German soldiers fighting for the British crown. But the geopolitical chessboard flips on them dramatically on Christmas night, 1776.
The Battle of Trenton.
Yes. This is the iconic moment immortalized in the famous painting of George Washington crossing the icy, treacherous Delaware River.
It was a desperate, high-risk surprise attack targeting a garrison of Hessian troops stationed in Trenton, New Jersey.
The Americans catch them largely off guard in the brutal winter weather. There were roughly 1,400 Hessian soldiers at Trenton.
And Washington's forces secure a massive tactical victory, killing, wounding, or capturing nearly two-thirds of the Hessian force.
Suddenly, the Continental Army finds itself managing roughly 900 highly trained German prisoners of war.
And they march a significant portion of them deep into Pennsylvania, housing them at the Lancaster barracks, far away from the front lines to prevent rescue.
Which perfectly aligns with Robert Coleman's labor crisis at Elizabeth Furnace. Adjutant General Hand has hundreds of idle prisoners in Lancaster. Coleman has an undug canal just miles away.
So how exactly did an Irish ironmaster essentially rent German prisoners from the American government? What were the economics of that deal?
The economics of the deal they strike is a masterpiece of bureaucratic efficiency, because Coleman doesn't just hand over a chest of gold to rent these prisoners.
Right, because the Continental Congress was chronically, almost fatally short on hard currency.
Exactly. So Coleman enters into a closed-loop credit system. The agreement stipulated that Coleman would lease the Hessian prisoners, paying a rate of 32 to 45 shillings per month for each man.
Historical economic analyses estimate that equates to roughly $172 a month in modern currency per soldier.
But instead of paying cash to the government, Coleman simply credited that amount against the massive invoices he was submitting to the Continental Army for the cannons and ammunition he was manufacturing.
Oh, that's brilliant. He was quite literally using the labor required to build the factory, to pay for the weapons the factory produced.
In August of 1777, the first detail of 22 Hessian prisoners of war marched into the grounds of Elizabeth Furnace.
And as the project scaled up, records indicate Coleman eventually employed a rotational workforce of up to 70 Hessians at any given time.
Their singular objective: execute the 1.3-mile engineering plan and connect Seglock Run to Furnace Run.
The physical mechanics of digging this trench, known forever after as the Hessian Ditch, are agonizing to conceptualize. I mean, these men are marching to the base of Cannon Hill. They are confronting a solid face of red sandstone and bedrock.
Right. To carve a channel 7 feet wide and up to 7 feet deep, you can't rely on shovels. Shovels are useless against bedrock.
They had to rely on the most primitive, concussive methods of stone extraction: the start chisel and the sledgehammer.
It's a process requiring immense physical stamina and coordination. One man kneels in the dirt, gripping a heavy iron star chisel, positioning the point against a fissure in a massive sandstone boulder.
And the second man stands above him, wielding a massive, long-handled sledgehammer.
The hammer strikes the chisel. Bone-jarring impact, over and over again.
They are literally pulverizing the rock, millimeter by millimeter, driving the iron wedge deeper into the stone until the internal pressure causes the boulder to fracture and split.
And once the rock was fractured into manageable pieces, other teams had to manually lift the jagged stone and dirt out of the trench.
But because they were carving this canal along the descending slope of the hill to maintain that crucial gravity gradient, they didn't just haul the debris away, did they?
No, they engineered the waste. They stacked the shattered boulders, the sandstone rubble, and the dense red clay strictly on the downhill side of the trench.
They were building an artificial, reinforced berm 8R, a continuous retaining wall stretching for 1.3 miles to ensure the water wouldn't spill over the downhill slope.
Archaeologist Dan Snyder, who conducted extensive surveys of the site for the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates, presented a fascinating timeline for this endeavor.
What did you find?
Based on the volume of earth moved and the sheer density of the stone, Snyder calculates that with multiple two-man teams chiseling, hammering, and hauling 6 days a week, the entire 1.3-mile canal was likely completed in a staggeringly fast 3 months.
3 months. 3 months of unrelenting, skeletal-shaking labor to physically alter the hydrology of a mountain.
It's incredible. But the brutality of the work was only half of the prisoners' daily reality. We have to examine how these men lived when they put the sledgehammers down.
Because they were enemy combatants, they weren't being housed in the comfortable wooden outbuildings of the estate.
Right. Local lore in the area had long pointed to a specific structure on the property, romanticizing it as the Hessian barracks.
But modern archaeological investigations, notably those led by Snyder and teams from Millersville University, dismantled that myth and revealed a much darker, much more claustrophobic reality.
The material evidence strongly suggests the prisoners were housed inside a disused casting house.
And a casting house is fundamentally an industrial structure designed to contain extreme heat and molten metal, right?
Yes. It is built for absolute structural integrity, not human comfort. Jim Kinter, writing a retrospective piece for a local newspaper in 1971, visited the ruins of these structures and explicitly described the atmosphere as dungeon-like.
The walls of the casting house were massively thick stone. And while this provided excellent thermal mass to contain furnace heat, when the furnace is off, thick stone walls create a notoriously damp, cold, cave-like environment.
And inside this high-ceilinged stone vault, the overseers constructed a highly dense, multi-tiered sleeping apparatus.
To maximize the floor space for 70 men, they built 3 layers of heavy wooden platforms, essentially stacked bunks rising up the walls.
The vertical clearance between these layers was brutally constrained. A grown man could not stand up or even sit up straight in his bunk. He had to crawl horizontally into a dark, narrow slot just to sleep.
And the ground floor beneath these stacked platforms served as a crowded common area, featuring a large corner fireplace, which was their sole source of warmth and their only facility for cooking whatever meager rations they were provided.
But the architectural security of the building is what truly highlights their status as prisoners.
There was no ground floor door.
In an era before barbed wire or electronic surveillance, you secure a perimeter using architecture and gravity. The only point of entry and exit for the entire casting house was a single door located high up on the exterior stone wall.
Wow. So to enter the building, the Hessians had to climb a tall wooden ladder.
At the end of a 12-hour shift swinging sledgehammers, 70 exhausted men would climb this ladder, file into the dark stone room, and crawl into their wooden slots.
And then the guards would simply pull the ladder away from the wall.
Yes. Without the ladder, a drop from that door would break a man's legs. They were effectively sealed inside a stone box until sunrise.
It was a miserable, grueling existence.
Mm-hmm.
But it is precisely within this miserable existence that the historical record provides a plot twist of such staggering Shakespearean irony that it almost defies belief.
This is the moment where the script of reality outpaces fiction.
Totally. Let's look at the management dynamic. Robert Coleman is a pragmatic Irish immigrant. He speaks English. He has just leased an operation staffed by dozens of German-speaking prisoners of war.
Coleman cannot communicate with them.
Right. He cannot issue complex engineering orders regarding the elevation gradient of the ditch. He cannot manage their rations, and he cannot maintain discipline if he can't speak their language.
He desperately needs a bilingual overseer who also possesses an intimate geographical knowledge of the Elizabeth Furnace estate.
Who does Coleman recruit for this highly specific middle management role?
Henry William Stiegel.
The deposed baron.
The deposed bear.
The absolute audacity of history. Stiegel, the flamboyant, self-obsessed tycoon who formerly owned the entire 10,000-acre estate.
The man who built the 75-foot party tower on Cannon Hill.
The man who fired artillery to announce his carriage rides. He has been rotting in a squalid debtor's prison, stripped of his wealth and his dignity.
And Robert Coleman actively intervenes to help secure Stiegel's release from prison, but not out of pure charity. He brings Stiegel back to Elizabeth Furnace solely to act as a translator and shift supervisor for the Hessian prisoners.
It is the ultimate humiliation. I cannot imagine a more brutal psychological environment for a man whose entire identity was built on aristocratic vanity.
It's astounding.
I was trying to map this onto a modern corporate equivalent. It would be like the flamboyant billionaire founder of a massive tech conglomerate burning through all his capital, bankrupting the company, and going to federal prison.
Right.
Then the pragmatic accountant who buys the bankrupt company out of foreclosure bails the founder out of jail, but only so the founder can return to the exact same headquarters, a building that used to have his name on it, to work the night shift as a middle manager in the basement, taking orders from the accountant.
That is a perfect analogy, and the spatial reality of it makes it even worse. Stiegel is standing at the base of Cannon Hill in the freezing mud, translating digging orders to exhausted prisoners.
He can literally look up the slope and see the exact footprint where his massive wooden party tower used to stand.
He is a lowly, indebted employee standing in the ruins of his own kingdom, working for the man who succeeded where he failed.
It broke him. The historical accounts are clear that Stiegel never recovered his wealth or his sanity.
No, after the ditch was completed and his usefulness waned, he lived entirely on the charity of friends and relatives.
Working occasionally as a clerk and a rural school teacher, until he died destitute and largely forgotten in 1785.
It's a tragic end to an incredibly colorful life. But his final translation work yielded results. The Hessian Ditch was completed.
The engineering gamble paid off perfectly. The waters of Seglock Run were successfully diverted down the 1.3-mile hand-carved canal.
The water plunged into Furnace Run, drastically increasing the flow.
The massive water wheel spun faster and with relentless consistency. The huge bellows pumped a continuous blast of cold air into the furnace.
The temperature soared, the molten iron flowed, and Robert Coleman fulfilled his massive contracts, supplying the Continental Army with the artillery and munitions crucial to winning the war for independence.
Which transitions us to the aftermath. The Revolutionary War concludes. The British surrender at Yorktown. The Treaty of Paris is signed. The United States is a sovereign reality.
The cannons at Elizabeth Furnace fall silent, returning to producing civilian goods like stoves and agricultural tools.
But what happens to the people and the physical landscape left in the wake of this massive conflict? Let's trace the human element first. What became of the 30,000 to 37,000 Hessian soldiers who were shipped across the Atlantic?
The demographic breakdown of the Hessian forces post-war is a sobering reflection of 18th century warfare and colonial policy.
Okay, let's break it down.
Of the total force, approximately 17,300 men eventually boarded ships and returned to their homeland in Germany.
So roughly half went back to the Landgrave.
Yes, the casualty figures account for a large portion of the missing. Around 1,200 Hessians were killed directly in combat actions.
But a far more devastating number, roughly 6,350 men, died from illness, disease, or camp accidents.
That statistic alone illustrates how lethally dangerous it was simply to exist in a military camp in the 1700s, where dysentery, typhus, and smallpox were far more efficient killers than musket balls.
But the most fascinating demographic is the remainder. Approximately 5,000 Hessian soldiers, representing about 17% of the entire deployed force, did not die, but they also refused to go home.
They chose to remain in the newly formed United States.
And this mass integration was not entirely organic, right? It was the result of a highly deliberate strategic policy enacted by the Continental Congress.
Oh, absolutely. The American leaders recognized that these Hessian soldiers were highly disciplined, skilled tradesmen, and experienced farmers. The young nation desperately needed population and agrarian labor to expand its frontiers.
So Congress actively engaged in psychological warfare and incentivized desertion. They circulated pamphlets written in German among the Hessian camps, promising land grants.
The official policy offered 50 acres of prime American land to any foreign private who deserted the British ranks. If you were a non-commissioned officer, the acreage offer was even higher.
Think about the immense gravity of that choice. If a Hessian soldier returns home, he goes back to being an impoverished subject in a heavily taxed autocratic principality, having bled for a war that only enriched his ruler.
But if he stays in Pennsylvania, he instantly becomes an independent landowner in a society without a feudal aristocracy.
It's the ultimate immigrant proposition.
Yeah.
And many of the men who survived the brutal labor of digging the ditch at Elizabeth Furnace and later worked the iron operations took that deal.
They settled permanently in Lancaster and Lebanon counties. They married local women, largely from the existing Pennsylvania Dutch communities, and deeply integrated into the cultural and architectural fabric of the region.
Their legacy is permanently stamped on the local geography. Just north of the Elizabeth Furnace estate, along modern-day Route 501, there is a small settlement called Waldeck.
And that name isn't an indigenous word or an English colonial name. It is named directly after the Principality of Waldeck in Germany, the home region of many of the soldiers who settled there.
The descendants of the men who swung sledgehammers to build Coleman's Ditch are still living, working, and farming in Lancaster County today.
It's a remarkable story of forced migration turning into foundational citizenship. The human legacy of the prisoners endured.
And the legacy of the man who rented them, Robert Coleman, certainly endured as well. The profits from those wartime munitions contracts provided him with immense capital.
He purchased Elizabeth Furnace outright, bought up several other massive iron plantations, including the famous Cornwall Furnace, and officially became Pennsylvania's first millionaire.
But his incredible financial success did not insulate his family from profound tragedy, did it?
No, it didn't. The history of the Coleman family intertwines with national political history in a very unexpected way. It centers on Robert Coleman's daughter, Anne Coleman.
And it really highlights the immense social pressures of the early 19th century elite.
Anne Coleman, living in the heights of Lancaster society, became engaged to a young, highly ambitious, and relatively poor lawyer named James Buchanan.
From the very beginning, it was a fraught relationship. Robert Coleman, fiercely protective of his wealth and his daughter, deeply distrusted Buchanan, believing the young lawyer was more interested in the Coleman fortune than in Anne's affections.
The historical lore suggests the engagement was strained by Buchanan's intense focus on his burgeoning political and legal career, and reportedly felt neglected.
And in the tight-knit, highly scrutinized social circles of Lancaster, rumors were weaponized. A fatal misunderstanding occurred.
What happened?
Buchanan had been away on a business trip. Upon his return to Lancaster, instead of going immediately to the Coleman estate to see his fiancée, he stopped at the home of another prominent family to drop off some documents.
Oh, wow.
It was an innocent administrative errand, but the rumor mill instantly twisted it. Word reached Anne that Buchanan was secretly courting the daughter of the other family.
In an era where reputation was paramount, Anne was devastated. She abruptly broke off the engagement.
Seeking to escape the suffocating gossip of Lancaster, she immediately traveled to Philadelphia to stay with her sister. But shortly after arriving in Philadelphia, Anne Coleman suddenly and mysteriously died.
The exact cause of death remains debated by historians. Some suggest illness, others heavily imply a broken heart or even suicide. But the impact of her death was explosive.
Robert Coleman was completely consumed by grief and rage. He placed the blame for his daughter's demise squarely and entirely on James Buchanan.
His fury was so absolute that he issued a strict mandate banning Buchanan from attending Anne's funeral or viewing her body.
The psychological impact on James Buchanan was profound and lifelong. He wrote agonizing letters about his grief. He swore that his romantic sentiments had gone to the grave with Anne Coleman.
He entirely abandoned the pursuit of marriage and threw his entire existence into his political career.
That obsessive political drive propelled him through the ranks of representative, senator, secretary of state, and ultimately the 15th president of the United States.
Which is why, to this day, James Buchanan remains the only lifelong bachelor president in American history.
A piece of national presidential trivia that traces its roots directly back to a tragic misunderstanding and the protective wrath of the ironmaster of Elizabeth Furnace.
It perfectly illustrates how localized personal histories ripple outward to touch the highest levels of national narrative.
It really does. But if we pull our focus away from the historical figures and look at the physical fate of the land itself, the modern reality of the estate offers a stunning visual contrast to the brutality we've been discussing.
Which brings us full circle, back to the pristine wedding venue we imagined at the very beginning of this deep dive. The estate did not simply crumble into ruins.
No, it experienced a massive, highly capitalized renaissance. Today, the 34-acre core of the original Elizabeth Furnace estate remains in the hands of the Coleman family.
Specifically, Craig and Bruce Coleman, who are seventh-generation descendants of Robert Coleman.
In 2013, they bought out a cousin's interest in the property and initiated an incredibly meticulous, multi-year architectural restoration project.
The architectural magazines detailing this restoration showcase a breathtaking transformation. They took the brutal, utilitarian structures of 18th century heavy industry and converted them into the pinnacle of modern luxury event spaces.
The Stiegel Stable, the massive stone building that originally housed the draft horses and mules that dragged the heavy sleds of charcoal and iron ore, has been completely retrofitted.
It now boasts climate control, radiant heated floors, and is illuminated by dazzling multi-tiered chandeliers.
And the charcoal barn, a structure that was originally designed to store massive piles of carbonized wood, a place where men would have been permanently coated in thick black soot, has been scrubbed, restored, and reimagined as an elegant space for intimate gatherings and cocktail hours.
They have installed formal tiered gardens with manicured boxwoods and a garden folly where couples stand to exchange their wedding vows.
It is a stunning monument to historic preservation and refined, curated beauty. But the magic of this specific plot of land is that the curated beauty only exists within that 34-acre footprint.
The moment you step off the manicured grass of the estate, you cross an invisible boundary line into State Game Lands number 46.
This is a massive tract of rugged wilderness now owned by the public. And hidden deep within those thick woods, the Hessian Ditch still exists.
It has endured for nearly 2.5 centuries. It hasn't been preserved. It has simply survived. The forces of nature have continuously assaulted it.
Centuries of autumn leaves have drifted into the canal, burying the original sandy floor. The root systems of massive oak and hickory trees have penetrated and disrupted the carefully stacked sandstone retaining walls the Hessians built.
Through natural infilling, the ditch is no longer the cavernous 7-foot-deep corridor it once was. In most places, the depression is now only 3 to 5 feet deep, though there are still specific shaded sections where the cut drops well over a man's head.
And the surrounding brush has grown so incredibly thick that if you didn't have a guide or a topographical map, you would likely walk right past it, assuming it was just a strange natural ravine formed by water runoff.
And people do walk past it constantly. The historical irony is that the site is highly trafficked, but utterly unrecognized.
The famous Horseshoe Trail, a massive public hiking route that connects Valley Forge to the Appalachian Trail, cuts directly through these woods.
Every single year, thousands of hikers walk within 100 yards of the Hessian Ditch.
They stop to take pictures of a famous geological oddity nearby called the Balanced Rock. They inadvertently march straight over the black-stained soil of the old charcoal pits, and they cross the path of the canal without ever realizing the staggering weight of the history beneath their hiking boots.
Fortunately, there are dedicated local historians actively working to ensure the ditch isn't entirely swallowed by the forest and forgotten.
Right. David Stoddard, a prominent member of the Lancaster Hiking Club, famously stumbled across the overgrown trench years ago. He utilized historical archives to identify it, and he established a tradition of leading annual guided hikes into the thicket.
He brings groups of locals and history enthusiasts out there, often accompanied by archaeologists like Dan Snyder, to stop in the middle of the woods and explain the mechanics of the sledgehammers, the reality of the casting house prison, and the sheer desperation of the Revolutionary War that birthed the canal.
Those guided hikes serve a crucial function. Maintaining a physical connection to the past is essential because when you stand in that trench, you are forced to grapple with the reality of the labor.
You aren't just looking at displaced dirt, you are looking at displaced lives.
Jim Kinter's 1971 retrospective article offered a truly profound reflection on the ditch that contextualizes the entire endeavor.
Kinter stood in that overgrown trench and pondered the bizarre geopolitical twist of fate that ripped these men from their farms in Hesse and deposited them in the dense woods of Pennsylvania to swing sledgehammers.
And he wrote that when you really consider their fate, there is a profound moral victory hidden in the dirt. He argued that it was infinitely better for these men to be usefully employed, even in the most brutal, exhausting manual labor imaginable, building a piece of civil infrastructure, rather than standing in a frozen field in New Jersey, killing other men or being killed themselves by musket fire.
That framing changes everything. The ditch was conceived as an instrument of war. Its sole purpose was to power a furnace to cast artillery to kill British soldiers.
But for the 70 Hessians who dug it, the ditch functioned as an instrument of survival. It removed them from the lethality of the battlefield.
The brutal labor of Cannon Hill kept them alive long enough for the war to end, allowing 5,000 of them to shed their uniforms, claim their 50 acres of land, and become Americans.
To attempt to summarize the staggering journey we've mapped out today, we began with an ancient landlocked sea that slowly birthed a ridge of red sandstone and iron ore.
That specific geology attracted an ambitious German immigrant who ignited a furnace.
That furnace fell into the hands of a flamboyant self-appointed baron who built a 75-foot party tower and fired cannons into the valley until his unchecked vanity landed him in a debtor's cell.
The bankrupt property was salvaged by a highly pragmatic Irish immigrant who, faced with the overwhelming logistical demands of a revolution, leveraged the political power of George Washington's inner circle to rent captured German soldiers.
To carve a 1.3-mile canal through solid rock, using the bankrupt baron as his humiliated translator, and today, centuries later, that exact same soil hosts joyous luxury weddings while the Great Trench slowly, quietly fades back into the forest.
It is a breathtaking layering of human ambition, tragedy, and endurance, all recorded in a single stretch of Pennsylvania earth.
It really is. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends. We spend so much of our lives looking at the beautifully curated parts of our world. We admire the meticulously restored stone mansions. We appreciate the gleaming slate roofs. We seek out the perfect manicured venues for our celebrations.
But I invite you to think about the invisible labor hiding in the landscapes you pass through every single day.
Exactly. The Hessian Ditch isn't just a quirky geographical oddity in Lancaster County. It is a permanent physical scar left upon the earth by men who were rented out by their sovereign ruler, treated as human currency, and shipped an ocean away to fight a war they had absolutely no personal stake in. The next time you take a walk through a seemingly untouched, peaceful stretch of forest, whether in Pennsylvania or your own backyard, I challenge you to look a little closer at the ground beneath your feet. Because that strange depression in the dirt, that unnatural contour of the earth you're about to step casually over, might just be a forgotten monument to someone else's desperate survival.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Uncharted Lancaster podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really helps more people discover the show. For more fascinating local history, visit unchartedlancaster.com. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out one of Adam Zern's books at unchartedlancaster.com/books. Until next time, keep exploring.